corporations and conglomerates, or will it also be the interests of the Indian citizens and in particular the Indian poor? So I think it's not true anymore that this is just Western. I think one interesting phenomenon is that inequality is internationalizing, it's anonymizing. It used to be based on nation, on religion, on markers, on gender, of course, very importantly, and that is all still with us, of course. But I think the trend, if it continues, is a trend where the rich will be from all religions, from all genders, from all parts of the world. The elite will be a global elite that has a common interest in trying to preserve their position and expand it if possible.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for a very comprehensive sort of survey of globalization and some of its shortcomings as far as rulemaking is concerned. I think the idea of the fund itself is very good, but the fact is that most of the medicines in the world today are still sold by multinational corporations. And there are different types of examples in this case. I mean, in India, for example, Ranbaxy grew and sold medicines in 22 countries, but has been taken over in the last few years by a Japanese corporation, Sankyo Daiichi, which has markets and products selling in 43 countries. One thing which is noticeable is that the essential drug prices in India have not gone up because the government in India imposes a certain limit on what you can charge, what a company can charge, and that applies to the new entity in the pharmaceutical trade as well. Now, I would like to know why this cannot be the case with countries where medicines are not cheap and they are entirely out of the reach of the poor. So whether or not a convention of the at the international level to appeal to the governments where to place certain restrictions on the multinational corporations which are selling most of the drugs, essential drugs, to have a minimum price which would be sort of not too much out of reach, or which would be within the reach of the poor people. So the government definitely has a role to play in fixing prices of essential commodities, and I think there we have globalization cannot be identified totally with the neoliberal philosophy that we have seen coming out of the United States. But we really have to talk about globalization for the elites and globalization for the people. And there the government has a definite role to play in turning one into the other. I would like to invite your comment on these observations.
Yeah, so definitely the government has a role to play, and what we need to think about carefully is how the government can best play that role. So what you're saying is certainly right, that many governments are trying very hard to control the prices that pharmaceutical companies are charging for their medicines. And there are various mechanisms. There's reference pricing, there's price discrimination, there are compulsory licenses that governments can often threaten pharmaceutical companies with if they sell the price at, put the price at too high a level. And then there are reimbursement conditions where a government can say that if you charge a price beyond this level, we will simply not reimburse the drug through the national health system. That's what the UK is doing, what Australia is doing, and so on. There's one fundamental problem. I support all these things, of course, but there's one fundamental problem with it, which is the dilemma between access and innovation. So everything that governments do to depress prices and thereby to improve access to medicines will also invariably reduce innovation incentives. pharmaceutical companies will at the margins not undertake a certain research project if they anticipate that they will be hampered in their efforts to then get high markups from paying customers, if they're not confident that they can charge the profit maximizing price. And that means that we are paying an unobvious but still very real price for these mechanisms of price reduction, in that pharmaceutical companies will in particular continue to neglect the heretofore neglected diseases of the poor. Because those are the ones where compulsory license is most irresistible, right? If you have a wonderful drug for one of these diseases concentrated among the poor, then who could blame a government that says, well, obviously this has to be made available to the poor, and so we will slap you with a compulsory license and force you to sell it at a reasonable price. If companies anticipate that, they will not do the research. This is not a speculation. This is a fact which I know from talking to lots of pharmaceutical researchers who say to me that research that has resulted in promising leads for drugs that might be of great use to poor people, such research is not only discontinued, but the people who know about it are sworn to secrecy. Such research is buried. And people often refer here to the Ivermectin story, which is a story about a river blindness drug that a famous Western company called Merck discovered by accident in doing veterinary research. They were incautious and announced to the world, we have this nice drug for river blindness now. And guess what the world said back? The activists came and they said, great, so now roll it out. We tell you where river blindness exists in Africa, and all you need to do is bring it there, find the patients, build roads, and make sure that everybody gets it for free. And Merck, of course, was taken aback, but more or less did what the activists were demanding, and it's still a big public relations coup for Merck, but it's a very expensive proposition, and I've heard Pfizer executives chuckle, saying, these idiots, they announced that they had this drug, and how stupid they were, ha ha ha, if we have something like that, and of course we don't, we will bury it deeply and not tell anybody about it. So there is this access innovation dilemma, which I think the Health Impact Fund solves in a very elegant way. It supports innovation where it's most needed without in any way hampering access. So let me say one more thing about the role of multinationals here. First of all, in one sense it's true that by having something like the Health Impact Fund, we are feeding pharmaceutical corporations. We are giving them additional profit opportunities. But it's not the traditional big multinationals that will benefit the most. There are other categories of pharmaceutical innovators that benefit a lot. These are new fledgling firms in developing countries like India, because in regard to the neglected diseases that will become very lucrative targets under the Health Impact Fund system, they have not as much of a disadvantage as they have with traditional diseases such as cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and so on. If an Indian company wants to compete with Merck and Pfizer and Sanofi on cancer, heart disease, and so on, they are miles behind. Those guys have already spent billions and billions of dollars looking through millions and millions of molecules. And so to get to the cutting edge, it would take you hundreds of millions of dollars. If you want to compete with the best companies on schistosomiasis or Chagas disease or malaria, you have a much, much better chance, because that's exactly the diseases that these companies have ignored. So the Health Impact Fund would level the playing field in favor of fledgling companies in poor countries which have patient populations available right there to study. And it would also benefit greatly public-private partnerships as well as those charity kind of innovation providers such as Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative, which are collecting money from donors, then developing a new drug, and then giving it away for cheap, which means that for the second research project they have to collect money all over again. These companies could now replenish their coffers by getting Health Impact Fund rewards without thereby increasing the prices for patients. So I think it would, on the whole, be a good thing for finding alternatives to the standard big multinational pharmaceutical corporations.
I think we have time for one more or two more questions. Sir, Mr. Anniv. Mike, please. Mike.
I come from Gujarat, and we try to take advantage of all the resources that we spend. So I want to take advantage of your presence. I think one of the problems, because at one level you were talking about a meta language across the globe, and at another level very interesting ideas of a practical plane. Now, as far as the meta language is concerned, what are practical ways of, because there is dominating knowledge also, as the Margolins put it. In other words, knowledge that is there in India doesn't necessarily carry the same weight as knowledge which emerges from the think tanks in the world as a whole. And I can give you 2 or 3 instances which really relate with what you said. I mean, when the G8, there was a case to be built for India and China. Paul Martin, who is an advisor to your project, had built up a project, and we were a part of it. And we said, if India is going to be there, it's going to talk about food security, what you said. It's going to talk about water. It's going to talk about energy. And very little of that has taken place in the G8. Because, the WTO, I don't want to get into those details. Or what you said about poverty. I mean, in 1977, when we defined poverty, in fact, I chaired a group which did it. We built up separately the price indices for the rich and the poor. And so that this problem that the World Bank measures have is not there in our this thing. Or just the fact that Rahul Gandhi is talking about migrants. He not only said it here, he even said it at Anand when he came to Irma. But this part, that intellectually there is something else which is going on there, which is relevant to these debates. It's not known. He talks about by migrants that as the growth process takes place, there are, as he said, the daddy who has to sit in an urban city. There are 2,000 towns which we have not even recognized as towns. We call them as census towns, where are millions of the kinds of people. But we have a big literature on all of this. Or even the very interesting and the fascinating example that you gave on health. See, if you look at the Indian literature, our leadership in the late 60s got some of the best minds in the world. The product and process business, which was there in our patent laws, didn't come out of thin air. It came out of very distinguished people like you, whom we paid for. They came here. They gave us that advice. And, we have a very strong literature which I think can support many of the things that you have said as we try to modernize our pricing mechanisms. But in what concrete way can the Rajiv Institute for Contemporary Studies push the fact that ideas in the third world don't really get known? And they are not a part of the big debate that you talk about. To me, that, if you give us some advice on that, that would really help us, because that is the mission that Gopal brought out.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, so that's a very hard question, and I may not be the best person to answer it, because I have spent most of my life as a philosopher sitting at a desk studying Kant and Rawls and Hegel and so on. But I give it a shot and see how far we get. So first of all, what you describe as the level and the meta level, you could call that substance and procedure, for example, those two things are very closely related to each other, I think. So in order to make a difference, in order to embed the interests of the poor more in the procedures of decision making, we have to empower the poor. We have to, in a sense, change the substance so that the poor have more of a share of global income, more of a way of expressing themselves, better education, and so on. So we have to work on both things simultaneously. The spiral that I described, this downward spiral, is one that affects both substance and procedure, the rules that are being adopted and the way these rules are adopted. And so we have to reverse the spiral, if you like. We have to make the procedures more pro-poor and also contest the outcomes in a way so that poor people are more empowered. Now, you brought in a third force, which is the force of ideas, the force of intellectuals. And that's exactly the force that I think has so far been underutilized. And of course, you're right that ideas get marginalized, and it's not just ideas that come from India or the developing world that get marginalized. My ideas get marginalized too, because they're the wrong ideas, right? This is not what people want to hear. So until 2008, when I said something that there are problems about this particular WTO-driven globalization process, everybody said, shut up, don't you know, rising tide lifts all boats, everything is great, poverty is melting away, and so on. And I was pretty much a lone voice. So, but that is changing. So here what we need to do, I think we have to have the confidence to confront politicians and officials who are presenting us with a very one-sided view of the world. A view of the world according to which poverty is getting better and better and so on. And I've tried that. And at first, you know, the people at the World Bank who developed these statistics just said, who are you? Some dumb philosopher tells us how to do our job? Go away. And then gradually, when I teamed up with an economist, Indian economist, by the way, and when we wrote papers that really looked like economics papers with lots of equations and all the right language in it and so on, then Joseph Stiglitz convened a conference in New York and said, I want to hear this. I want to, you know, get together and so on. And let's look at this and whether the World Bank's poverty measurement methodology really is flawed. And so a whole volume was created out of that. Many World Bank officials were there and so on, and it got a bit of a hearing. Now, we were lucky, of course, that Joe Stiglitz was there to give us that hearing. But I think that the World Bank and many other of these officials, they depend for their respectability on this mantle of we are the experts, we know what we are doing. And that comes even in the mind of the public with certain obligations. You cannot simply ignore arguments if the arguments come from reputable sources and so on. And so we just have to contest. You know, the first time you'll be ignored, people will say, who are you? You don't know anything and so on. Just persist. Give the best argument, and sooner or later, other people in the profession, other people who know something will say, well, actually, he's right. Actually, there is a problem. And so there is something nice about intellectual discourse, that it has a bit of a tendency to wash itself clean. I know very well that a lot of academics, a lot of experts are bought. They know on which side their bread is buttered, in our European expression. And I don't know what that is with naan, but anyway, they say the kinds of things for which they get rewarded. Globalization is good and so forth. But we have to, I think, contest that discourse and make sure that there are some reputational costs on people who lightly and without much evidence are just defending some status quo.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's exactly 8:31. So we've had 3 scintillating interventions. I request that we join our hands together to express our appreciation for Sri Rahul Gandhi, Professor Poga, and Professor Basu. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's been a wonderful experience. We look forward to having you on the next such occasion. Thank you very much and good night.